Concept 52.3 is all about aquatic biomes, the water biomes. They are also very diverse and dynamic parts of the earth. We might not be as familiar with them because, of course, we don't live in the oceans or we don't make our home in aquatic biomes, but they can be pretty interesting and cool as well. Aquatic biomes account for the largest part of the biosphere in terms of area, of course. There is more water than there is land here on planet Earth, so it's helpful to know about some of these biomes, and they show less latitudinal variation than the terrestrial biomes. So you're not going to see as great of changes as you go, say, north and south from the equator as you do with the land, because the water is good at moderating temperatures and moderating some of the environmental changes. Marine biomes, when we say the word marine, we mean saltwater oceans and seas. Marine biomes have salt concentrations of about 3%, which doesn't sound like a lot, but if you've ever gone to the ocean and accidentally taken a gulp of salt water, seawater, you know 3% can be pretty darn high. The largest marine biome is made of the oceans, which cover about 75% of the Earth's surface and have an enormous impact on the entire Earth, on the biosphere as a whole. Freshwater biomes like lakes and streams and ponds have salt concentrations of less than 0.1%, and freshwater biomes are closely linked to soil and the biotic components of the surrounding terrestrial biome. So you're talking like about a small little pond or a lake or a stream or a river. They are more closely tied to the land around them, of course, because they tend to be surrounded by the land. When we talk about aquatic biomes, there's lots of vocabulary words that we use that might be unfamiliar to you because we don't generally spend a lot of time on the aquatic biomes, but there's a few that we need to know. A lot of these aquatic biomes can be subdivided based on, well, a couple different things. They can be subdivided based on how much light enters that area. So, of course, as you go deeper, there's less and less light that gets down to those areas. So the shallow areas near the top of the water tend to have a lot of light. And then as you go deeper, it gets darker and darker. We can also talk about temperature changes, of course. Again, toward the top, the temperatures tend to be higher than toward the bottom. And then depth. So these three factors are different zones that we can talk about within the aquatic biomes. That upper zone is called the photic zone. Think about that word photic. It means light. So photic zone that has sufficient light for photosynthesis. So again, photic zone, photosynthesis. So that means you can have plants that live in this area. That's going to be the top portion of the water. The lower areas where there's not enough light that gets through is called the aphotic zone. Receives very little light. So if we're talking about light, we can talk about the photic and the aphotic zones. The photic and the aphotic zones altogether make up something called the pelagic zone. That's going to be basically the big chunk middle of the water. And then very down deep at the bottom, we have what's called the abyssal zone. And if we're talking about the ocean, the abyssal zone is way down deep at the bottom where all sorts of weird little creatures live. There's no light, and it's like an alien world. At the very bottom of a lake or the very bottom of the ocean, you have all this material that sits on the bottom of the ocean floor. We call that material the organic and the inorganic sediment. We call that the benthic zone. And there's certain very odd creatures that live way down there at the bottom. All together, these communities of creatures that live way far away from the light, we call those the benthos. And they primarily survive off of detritus. Detritus is dead organic matter that falls like snowfall, that falls all the way down toward the bottom. So you have all this living activity going up above where there is light and warmer temperatures and lots of fish and living creatures. And then as creatures die, as creatures get eaten, as body parts decay, you have basically this snowfall of dead material coming down to the bottom of the ocean. That dead material is called detritus, and that's an important source of energy and food for these benthos creatures that live at the very bottom. They can't do photosynthesis. They don't have access to light. And so this material that falls from above tends to be what basically runs their entire little ecosystem. A picture is worth 1,000 words, so we could look at a lake. A lake would have a photic and an aphotic zone. Photic is where the light hits and you can have plants. Aphotic is too deep for the light. And then we can have a pelagic zone, which is basically in a lake or actually in the ocean, that would be all of the area, the whole pelagic zone. And then along the bottom we have what's called the benthic zone. We haven't talked about these yet, but we will in just a second. In the oceans, again, the photic zone is going to be just the top layer. The ocean, of course, has a huge aphotic zone. All of this is pelagic. Way down at the bottom is the abyssal zone, and then that layer as you go along the ocean floor, or the floor, is called the benthic zone. In the oceans and most large lakes, you have something called a thermocline. That's kind of like a boundary between the warm water and the cold water. And if you've ever gone to a lake on a hot summer's day, you probably feel this. If you go out and swim out to where it's about 15 or 20 feet deep, and you are treading water in the top, say 10 feet of water, it's pretty warm. But if you start to dive down, you can feel how there's a sudden change between the warm water and the cold water, and it's almost like a line. That line is called the thermocline, and the warmer, less dense water tends to not mix very well with the colder water down below. So if you go to a lake over the summer, go out to where it's about 20 feet deep and dive down, and you will feel this thermocline where the water tends to change very quickly from one temperature to another. That's in the oceans as well. Now, oftentimes lakes undergo kind of a turning or mixing during the spring and fall as the temperatures begin to change, and you'll have this mixing called turnover. It brings up the cold water from the bottom and kind of mixes in the warm water from the top, and that's a good, healthy thing. It mixes in fresh oxygen, and it mixes in nutrients, and kind of mixes the entire lake to kind of even out some of the materials. So if we were looking at a particular lake, you might notice the thermocline, where you have in winter, if it's frozen over at the top, you see there's not a huge difference in temperature. In spring and autumn you have this turnover, but look at the summer, where the top areas can be, say, 22 degrees Celsius, but as you dive down you can see it changes pretty quickly, and there's like layers of temperature as you go. That's called a thermocline. The types of creatures that you're going to find in an aquatic environment are affected by the amount of sunlight and the temperature and the depth. Most creatures live in the shallow parts of the water, in the photic zone, where they have access to light, because that's where the plants are going to be, and plants tend to be the ones that start off most food systems or food chains. The aphotic zone in the oceans is huge, but it doesn't have as much life as the upper photic zone does. If we look at a map of the world, it's a little bit difficult to map out all of the various biomes, the aquatic biomes. Of course, the vast majority of the world is ocean. That would be pelagic and benthic zones of the ocean. But then you can see some coral reefs and some things called estuaries, and of course rivers and lakes. So we'll talk a little bit about all of those as well. Again, I'm not going to expect you to know tiny little details about each one of these, but you need to know some of the basics, how to describe them and how they're different or how they're alike. Most aquatic biomes can be characterized by their physical environment, the chemical environment, what type of creatures live there, what are the climate conditions, and that type of thing. We can start with lakes, which can vary in size from just a small farm pond up to, say, something like the Great Lakes, Lake Superior, Lake Ontario, and the like. Temperate lakes have a seasonal thermocline. Tropical lakes tend to have a year-round constant temperature, constant thermocline. We can divide lakes into what we call oligotrophic, or it could be oligotrophic, and they are nutrient poor and generally oxygen rich. These would be like high cold mountain lakes that tend to be very clear and very beautiful, but they don't have a lot of nutrients in them. They do have a lot of dissolved oxygen because colder water can hold more oxygen. So those would be oligotrophic. I'm going to look up that word, make sure I'm pronouncing it correctly. Oligotrophic, I was pronouncing it right. Oligotrophic lakes. So I'll show you a good example of this, a picture. The other type of lake is called eutrophic. Eutrophic are nutrient rich, but they tend not to have as much oxygen, and especially if the ice covers them in the winter, they're going to be kind of low in oxygen. So a good picture kind of helps. So here is an oligotrophic lake in Grand Teton National Park in Wyoming. Lots of oxygen but not a lot of nutrients, tend to be very clear and pretty. And then here's a eutrophic lake, which oftentimes tends to be kind of dirtier looking, lots of plants and animals, kind of more brown, muddier water, high in nutrients but perhaps not as high in oxygen. Eutrophic lakes have more surface area relative to their depth, so eutrophic lakes tend to be a bit more shallow, and the creatures that live in them are different. Rooted and floating aquatic plants live in the shallow areas, the littoral zone, which is close to the shore, and then farther away from the shore where the water is too deep to have a plant that can reach all the way down to the bottom. You can't have roots all the way down to the bottom. That's called the limnetic zone. In the limnetic zone, you don't really find like plants that are rooted to the bottom because the water's too deep, but you do find some floating plants and some small little drifting plants and aquatic creatures, zooplankton and that type of creature. So in the littoral zone, which is close to the shore, you can have plants that reach all the way down to the bottom and have roots down in the soil below the surface of the water. But in the limnetic zone, the water's too deep for that. So lots of little creatures that live in some of these areas, including different sorts of little plankton, which smaller and larger creatures feed on. Invertebrates live in the benthic zone, which is going to be, remember, along the bottom as you go down. And fishes live in all zones as long as there's sufficient oxygen. One thing that happens sometimes in some of these lakes and ponds and streams is humans cause changes by accidentally putting too much nutrient into the pond. Like if this was a lake or a stream or a pond near a farm, there might be some fertilizer runoff, and that causes all sorts of problems within the lake because now there's too many nutrients and you have a huge bloom of algae and plants. Suddenly there's not enough oxygen, and sometimes you have what's called a fish kill or a fish die-off, where a lot of the fish die. They basically suffocate because they can't get enough oxygen. So sometimes human activity can affect some of these lakes and streams and waterways that we're talking about. Let's talk a little bit about wetlands. Wetlands are kind of a combination of both dry land and a lake or wet water area. They are a habitat that is covered in water for at least part of the time of the year, supports a lot of plants that are well adapted to water saturated soil, high organic production and decomposition, low oxygen. Lots of areas around rivers and streams and lakes along the coast where it often floods would be considered a wetland. Wetlands are very important to the ecology of our planet because there are tremendous amounts of plants and animals that live in these wetland areas, and there's a huge diversity of invertebrates and birds and everything from mammals like otters to amphibians like frogs and reptiles like alligators. And unfortunately, even though they are a very important part of our world, a huge bunch, a high percentage of the wetlands of our planet have been destroyed or have been damaged by human activity. Think about, for example, not too many years ago, the big oil spill out in the Gulf of Mexico, and that it washed up on the shores of Louisiana and Texas, and it just did horrible amounts of damage to the wetlands along the coast of Texas and Louisiana. And so that type of thing, unfortunately, is fairly common in some of the human activities and how we impact our environment. Streams and rivers, you guys are probably familiar with streams and rivers. We don't have a lot of flowing water here in our part of Texas, but of course if you go to say down around near Austin, or you go up to someplace like Colorado or mountainous areas, lots of streams and rivers. Of course the main thing about them is that there is motion, there is current, there is movement. The headwaters where they begin are generally cold, clear, turbulent, high oxygen, low nutrients, oftentimes starting high up in the mountains, and then as you get further downstream the water slows down. It tends to pick up a lot more sediment. It gets kind of dirtier and browner and more turbid, and so it looks a little bit different than from where it began. Oftentimes the rivers, as they meet the ocean, they tend to be wide and large, where they tended to be very small when they began. So this would be like a headwater stream in the Great Smoky Mountains, and then by the time that it gets close down to the ocean shore, the river may be miles across. Think about the Mississippi River, which starts off as all sorts of little streams and then ends up as a river that in some cases is over a mile wide as it goes down toward the Gulf Coast. Huge diversity of living creatures that live in rivers depending on the location that we're talking about on the earth. Lots of diversity of fish and invertebrates. One of the main problems with rivers is pollution. Humans have for many years tended to use rivers just kind of like a big septic pipe. in the olden days in cities, lots of cities were built on the river. So like London and other large cities around the world were built right on a river, and a lot of the sewage and trash and pollution was just dumped right into the river, and no one even cared about it as long as it floated away and went downstream. And of course we don't do that as much now, but in developing parts of the world they still do that, and even in our more developed part of the world, we still tend to use rivers sort of as a trash bin, and we tend to pollute them quite a bit. Also, we have to think about where we have dammed rivers to create electricity and the like, and we've done flood control and we've changed the course of rivers. That of course has a big effect on the ecosystem and the animals and plants that call that river home. If you start way up in the mountains and you follow that little stream until it becomes a river, eventually that river, most rivers are going to end at the ocean. Where the river meets the ocean, we have what we call an estuary. An estuary is like a transition zone between the freshwater river and the saltwater ocean. And so it's a mix of fresh and salt water. And the amount of salt water, ocean water to fresh water kind of changes as the tides rise and fall. Estuaries are another very important ecosystem, very rich in diversity of living creatures, lots of complex kind of interplay between the river and the ocean, where you have all sorts of channels and islands and wetlands and mud flats, salt marshes, and all sorts of different cool little ecosystems, lots of invertebrates, fish, waterfowl, reptiles, marine mammals. We use wetlands quite a bit because we grow and farm and catch things like oysters, crab, and fish. And unfortunately, again, due to pollution and other uses, we have changed quite a bit of the wetland and estuaries around the world. So here's a good example of an estuary. It's basically this area where the river and the ocean meets, and sometimes it's flooded, sometimes it's not. You have a mixture of salt and fresh water and all these little channels and islands and tons of wildlife. This might be, say, where the Mississippi River Delta empties into the Gulf coast. If you've ever been lucky enough to take a vacation to the ocean, you might have seen the tides as they come in and go out, the rise and fall of the water level throughout the day. You can find intertidal zones, which is an area that is covered with water when the tide is high, but it's dry land when the tide is low. There are certain particular creatures that live in these areas. Oxygen and nutrient levels tend to be high in these areas, but you got to have some particular creatures because they usually have to have adaptations to hold on to the rocks so they don't get washed away with the waves and the tides coming in and out. Lots of cool little creatures that live in these intertidal zones. Some of them tend to be rocky areas like what you see here, have starfish and all sorts of oysters and clams and all sorts of cool little creatures that you can go down to the shore and take a look at. Some of these intertidal zones tend to be more sandy instead of rocky, and you'll find different creatures that live there. So in the sandy ones you'll find worms and clams and crustaceans that bury themselves inside the sand and the dirt. Other places you'll find sponges, sea anemones, small fish, starfish, things like that. Of course, again, pollution, especially like oil spills and the like, can have a major effect on these intertidal zones, these intertidal areas. Getting away from the shore, we can head out to the open waters of the ocean. This would be the pelagic zone of the ocean. This makes up virtually 3/4 of our planet. I mean, it covers 70% of the Earth's surface. Oxygen levels are high. There's constant turnover of water because of constantly mixing currents and wind conditions. You kind of have this renewal of nutrition and oxygen levels as the deeper waters and the shallow waters get mixed along the coasts, and because of all these ocean currents. So you tend to have a huge amount of life in the ocean pelagic zones. Everything from tiny microscopic phytoplankton and zooplankton all the way up to the largest living creatures on the planet. So we have zooplankton like krill and protists and jellies and invertebrates and copepods, and then they feed slightly larger creatures like shrimp and crab, and they feed the fish, and they feed the seals, and that feeds the shark, and you just go up higher and higher. So everything from blue whales, the largest creatures on Earth, down to tiny little microscopic zooplankton and phytoplankton. Now some of the things, of course, that we have done to affect the oceans include pollution. Again, oceans used to be kind of like our dumping ground, our trash bin, and we used to just dump everything in the oceans. We're getting better about doing that, but still we pollute the oceans quite a bit. And then other things like overfishing, where we have taken so many of a particular species of fish that the population becomes very unstable and can't renew itself. So there are some problems, even though you would think, well, the ocean is so large, I mean, there's nothing I can do that would affect it. But when you get 6 or 7 billion people on the planet, yeah, we can and we have had a tremendous effect on the world's oceans. Lots of cool videos in the notes folder. Here's one of a shark attacking and eating a seal. So you want to check out the Chapter 52 notes folder and you can find some of the cool videos I put in there. Here's a good shot of a whale breaching in the open ocean off the island of Hawaii. It's kind of weird to think, if you've ever been out to the ocean. I've never been very far out into the oceans. I've only been off the coast. But I can imagine it's kind of humbling to get out there on a ship or something like that in the middle of the ocean and look around and see nothing but water as far as the eye can see. It's a complete different environment that we're not used to, and it's kind of odd to think that that's 70% of our planet, not the environment that you and I are used to living around. Another cool area of the world's oceans will be coral reefs. Coral reefs are formed from the calcium carbonate skeletons, the deposits of the cnidarians that we talked about, called coral, and they build these giant reefs in shallow, warm ocean water areas in the photic zone. Usually in warmer areas, 20 to 30 degrees Celsius tend to be very clear. There are some deep sea corals that live at greater depths, but most of the corals that we talk about when we talk about coral reefs tend to be in the more shallow areas. They require a high amount of oxygen concentration, and they require some sort of rocky solid surface to attach to. Again, the Great Barrier Reef, that's a big coral reef in Australia. There's coral reefs in the tropics, in the Bahamas, off the coast of North America. And a coral reef is a very good indicator of the health of the ocean. And when there is pollution or low oxygen levels, coral reefs tend to show that pretty quickly. And unfortunately, we have done quite a bit of damage to coral reefs. And one of the big problems with global warming is that it increases the acidification of oceans, because you have an increased amount of carbon dioxide dissolving into the ocean water, which creates carbonic acid, and that acidification has done some damage to the coral reefs around the world as well. Lots of cool videos. You can take a look at those, and then of course you can always find beautiful pictures online of a coral reef. If you've ever watched Finding Nemo, you're probably familiar with what a coral reef looks like, at least in animated form. Finally, let's mention the marine benthic zone. Remember, the benthic is along the bottom of the ocean floor. So sometimes this can be in the shallow areas, but then you kind of follow the bottom as it drops off and gets into the deeper areas, all the way down to the abyssal zone. There are some very weird creatures that live down there in the abyssal zone. The very deep benthic abyssal zones, those creatures have to be adapted to a life without sunlight. Tremendously cold and tremendously high water pressure. There are some odd ones that live way down there. And talk about an alien world. It might as well be another planet when you go down there to the abyssal zone of the oceans. Usually the substrate down there is just a soft sediment. There's not a lot of rocky areas down there in the abyssal zone, but in some areas of the earth there are, but it tends to just be soft sediment and that detritus falling from above. You will not find plants down there in the abyssal zone. Now you can find plants in the upper, more shallow areas of the benthic zone. Remember, benthic is just following the bottom contours. So if you're in the more shallow areas of the benthic, you can still find some plants. But as you go deeper, you're going to run out of sunlight, and you're not going to have any plants from that certain level down to the aphotic zone down below. At the various deepest levels of the ocean, we have these deep sea hydrothermal vents, which produce heat from the Earth's core, and they bring up this nutrient, these chemicals from the Earth's core providing for warmer temperatures and providing for a process whereby living creatures take in chemicals and use them to create energy. So unlike plants that use sunlight to do photosynthesis, these creatures live off of the chemicals coming from these deep sea vents. Very odd, very weird places down deep inside the ocean. Perhaps, oddly enough, maybe the conditions that caused or brought about early life in the very beginning of our planet. There are some changes that we have made even to these deep areas. Again, dumping of waste and pollution that does in some cases float all the way, or not float, but drift and fall all the way down to the ocean floor, and can have an effect on even these creatures that live way down below. You want to look up some cool videos of hydrothermal vents maybe, or you want to see some of the creatures that live at the bottom of our planet. They are pretty darn odd. We're going to take a break right there. We're going to go back and talk a little bit about the interaction between living creatures and their environment, and that would be concept 52.4. We'll take a break. We'll be right back.